We are students of the art of play.
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
A show for the players who ask, why?
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
So Gaia, what's our topic today?
So today we're going to be doing a long-awaited episode for The Art of Play. We've been talking about this in nearly every episode. We've been digging into many of the pure aspects of it. Today, we finally talk about world building.
Okay, so we're going to talk about world building sort of in the context of video games, but we're also going to do a little exercise where Gaia and I build a world on air. We've planned none of this beforehand, so we'll see how this goes. We're not going to do the classic thing of like drawing a map together because nobody else can see that.
Yeah, how do we draw a map? Visually define your map. Give me the angles by voice.
At the
30-degree turn
point,
north.
At the point 1-4, there's a city.
We just verbally describe a grid.
This is how we also play chess. Is just speaking.
We
at
play
each
chess.
other.
Okay, yeah.
No, we don't. I want to make it very clear I don't know how to do that.
We don't want people to think that we do that. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to build a world and many of the good and bad ideas and tips that you can get within world building. Mainly with the idea that you as a player listening to this episode could be able to identify designed worlds and poorly designed worlds within video games and understand why they might feel good or feel bad. And then, as Vi said, we'll go more into the exercise.
One of the things that I'll say about just feeling like you don't understand a world or that a world is built poorly is when rules of a world are broken. And we're going to talk about this later, but when you feel sort of betrayed by a world where you're like, I understand completely, and then, you know, the author or the video game developer is like, actually, no. That's where I feel sort of cheated.
When the author pulls like the Harry Potter on you and suddenly Dumbledore is not straight. Just the sudden author divine wisdom coming out and feeling like it's necessary to understand parts of the world, right? That's bad world design. In its core, that's what we don't want to see. Yeah. So what we're going to do, we're going to break down this episode into 3 phases. The first phase of this episode is going to be a series of steps on how to build a world well. And just general discussion on what is good, what is bad, what are good examples, what are bad examples.
Yeah. We're
going to follow this up with a series of tips and tricks within your world building to make things feel more lively, more entertaining, or just more well written. And then we're going to go right into the exercise of building a world together live.
Following our little steps.
Following these steps that we've talked about and following these tips so that you as a listener can get a good idea of it, even in the most rudimentary of senses, because, you know, it's just verbal. So I want to start off with the steps today. What can you do? What is the ABCs of world building? So I think, Vi, you've had a really good discussion on our first step so far. So why don't you kick us off, introduce us to how do you start building a world?
So let's speak about this specifically in the context of tabletop RPGs for just a second. When you sit down with your players and you've like, okay, we've picked a time slot and we all know that we have a game available to us, or the potential for a game. That's when you start looking at your themes. And normally this is where you pick like a game system as well, but we're just going to ignore game systems for now.
Yeah, world building is agnostic to the system itself.
Yes.
Your worlds, you put a system on top of your world to interact with it, but the world itself exists before the system. Yeah,
before, like, there are thematic elements that you will get from a game in just how the mechanics work, but you kind of know that you're going to sit down and play a game of Blades in the Dark. You're going to sit down and play a game of, like, Dungeons and Dragons. Like, you know what you're doing.
Yeah, you can build a world around your system, but a good system doesn't make a bad world suddenly entertaining, but a good system makes a good world better.
Exactly. So just for the moment, we're going to take the game system, the game mechanics, and we're just going to sort of put it back on the bookshelf. This is just, you know who your friends are. You kind of know what kind of games they like to play. Let's pick a theme, right? So this is the type of world that you want. And I've talked about this a little bit before. So this is your, do I want to play a Studio Ghibli kind of game, or do I want to play like a cyberpunk kind of game? This is where you look at your touchstones, right? What TV shows do we think are fun? Like my family's home game is based on The Witcher, right? Or do we want to play something that's based on very classic Roman mythology? Do we want to do like a Percy Jackson kind of thing? Like this is where you specifically can pull from worlds that you like and books and TV and just stories that you're interested in. This is where you get to paint with broad strokes to kind of understand the kind of palette you're using. So in a Ghibli-esque world, right, you're going to get a lot of color. You're going to get a lot of nature. You know that your nature is pretty dense. You know that things have spirits, right? Those are pretty fundamental things to most Ghibli films. But if you're going to play something like Cyberpunk, you know that you're going to play something that's probably dystopian, probably pretty urban, and is kind of like dark and maybe like a little bit film noir, but then like splashed with neon. And you're going to have some interplay between what it means to be human in a world that is very closely like related to technology and cyber augmentation.
Yeah, cyber enhancement, cyber modification,
yeah.
Human transcendentalism, I think.
So you already know your themes of the game, right? You're going to touch on humanity. What does it mean to be human in this cyberpunk context? But you're also going to have the same kind of question in a Ghibli inspired setting.
But let's also like talk about what happens when this goes wrong. Let's say you watched Spirited Away, a wonderful Ghibli movie that I think is like the cornerstone of like the whole idea of Ghibli films. So you have this wonderful spirited hotel in another kind of worldly kind of theming kind of setting, right? Now imagine if that setting was suddenly very mechanical, very brown with neon signs, but nothing else was changed.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Like, that doesn't sound like a good movie. Everything feels jarring and suddenly different, and as if it doesn't play well together. It's
the feeling of when you're watching like a cartoon and they're like, and now we're gonna switch to like realism.
Yeah.
Right? Like did the Smurfs movie do this, where they started in a cartoon and then they like jumped into...
The Smurfs did do it. A lot of films have done it.
Okay, I was like imagining the Smurfs and I was like, I don't think this film actually exists. It was one of those. Anyway, so you know sort of what's going to happen in your world based on the themes of the world, right? In Spirited Away, it's sort of fundamentally a kid's movie, right?
Fundamentally.
The main character is a kid.
Yeah, or so maybe a family movie, I think.
Yeah, so you know that your story is going to revolve around family, right? Because your audience is children for the most part, right? Whereas if you're looking at something like, you know, let's stick in the same theme, but you're looking at something like Princess Mononoke, you can look at different aspects of different themes based on your audience, right? So as opposed to more of a family, you've got something that's a little bit more like, how do we look at the spirits of this world? What are we interested in exploring?
Yeah. And if I can throw kind of a completely different idea, let's say you want a game that's built around the theming of war, violence, loss, tragedy, and then you put it in an art style and a world more similar to a Ghibli film. Now, that could work. There have been films that have done it before, but you're really fighting an uphill battle at that point in terms of world design. It's just, you need to make sure your theming and your ideas play well together. And if they generally are opposed, that you're putting in that extra time to get the theme just right before you even start building that world itself.
The one campaign that I'll point to that actually does these two, like, melange of two themes really well is Dimension 20's A Crown of Candy, which is a Game of Thrones inspired campaign that's set in Candyland. So like it's fantastic. It should be kind of fun and like, you know, sort of cute, but it's terrifying. Like I guess spoilers for A Crown of Candy, two of the characters straight up die. Like, it's a very, very dangerous world, which is kind of juxtaposed really well with the idea of like, oh yeah, we're all just candy, but then you're like, but my sister's dead, and you have PCs crying at the table. So your themes can be juxtaposed. You just need to know what they are,
what your goal is,
and if that juxtaposition is useful to you.
And there are many examples of this working in video games. Many people actually might think of juxtaposed themes through the game Team Fortress 2, which might sound like a weird example, but this is a cartoony, kind of animated, kind of fun theme around unspeakable levels of small-scale military violence against each other, right? And it works because they thought about that and built that theming system from the beginning. And they built up from that point of cartoony war.
Right. So if you're sitting down to design a campaign, or you're sitting down to help your GM maybe like come up with ideas for a game, you can say, these are themes I'm interested in exploring. One of the things that I have done in games is to say, like, okay, so we have touchstones, right? We're going to play, just because we've been talking about it, we're going to play Studio Ghibli. I'm like, what are your favorite things to see happen to characters? And also, what about this world are you interested in exploring, right? If you sort of paint in broad strokes now that you have the theme, right? And you go, okay, Ghibli world, there's an order of knights and they're supposed to, I don't know, they're supposed to protect something. And you sort of leave it vague, right? They sort of do this, and there's these people, and they kind of do that. And there's this group of people, and they sort of do this. You can ask your players what they're interested in exploring. And that tells you sort of where to build more, right? If you walk into this and you go, and there's sort of a church, and they're kind of like this, and you have nobody want to explore what the church is like, you don't have to spend any time at all talking about the hierarchy of the church, right? You never have to do that in your planning. You can just be like, yep, there's a church, it's over there, there's buildings sometimes.
Now, admittedly, we're straying a little far from the idea of theming.
Yes.
So I'm going to pull this one back for a second and go on to point 2. So let's say you've developed a theme. You know you want cartoony war, Studio Ghibli kind of fantasy, or something like that. What do you do next? Well, the next big question is, where does your world building actually start? Mm-hmm. Now, admittedly, we could look to video games for this. We could look to TTRPGs, but books have given us a much better idea for this. So let's turn to Lord of the Rings for a second. The hallmark of appropriate world building, the founder of the modern fantasy genre. Where did it start?
Languages.
It started with languages. Tolkien was often quoted saying that part of the reason why he made Lord of the Rings was as an excuse because of his absolute love of building fantasy languages. Mm-hmm. He spent years of his life defining the various Elvish languages, the Dwarvish languages, and so on. And while not all of his notes still exist from that time period, and we don't know the exacts of the languages, he built an entire system for how the words work and how they would be spoken. And he started building cultures and people around these languages. Why would this language behave this way? In real life, why do some languages behave that way? What influence caused it? What societies formed around it? Can we do that here?
It also talks about the proximity of people to each other.
Exactly. But you might take a completely different route. You might personally think, there are these characters that I want to see in a world. So I'm going to build a world that would cause these characters to exist and allow them to do the things I want them to do. Admittedly, Lord of the Rings also tends to feel like that, which I think is where a lot of his more specific world building came in. But many other books feel that way, right? Hell, some authors have taken a completely different approach where, who wrote Narnia?
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis partially took the approach of wanting to talk about religion in a different way. His entire book feels like a pseudo-Bible in some way.
I will also say that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, of course, were friends, but also had a club called the Inklings, which I think is really fun, and famously had a rivalry about, like, C.S. Lewis was like, I don't know, anything goes, right? There's a lamppost. I don't really care why it's there. It's just there. And Tolkien went, absolutely not. Everything has a reason. Everything has a method for being. Everything has a raison d'etre. And C.S. Lewis is like, I don't know, Jesus lion, like
Jesus lion lamppost.
Satyrs.
Santa Claus is canonically in that book.
Yeah.
Which I often forget.
I think the beavers should be big. Like,
why not?
Why not? Right? And these are all, but they all speak to your theme of the world and where you start, right? We know that it's going to be a little bit weird when we enter Narnia, right? We know that, like, okay, beavers are going to be big, things can talk. It's going to be a little bit, like, it's going to be a little bit Alice in Wonderland, right? It's going to be kind of fun. But if you're reading Tolkien, you know that everything is going to be very specific and everything is going to happen for a reason or has happened for a reason. Those ruins that you encounter aren't just ruins. That's like, you know, a king's palace and somebody's going to tell you about the history of that place.
Exactly. And we can look towards video game examples of this too. While we can't be certain where the design process started for most games, because that's kind of like a trade secret, you can see in the Persona series they wanted to focus on explorations of the mind and how we could give a unique perspective on that exploration of the mind. Just to give it an example. Or maybe you, as a GM for your next TTRPG, whatever it may be, want a big, menacing tower in the distance to approach, kind of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild style, right? Which might be where that game started, given how the world building feels so fleshed out around the idea of monuments.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Monuments and ruins, yeah.
Exactly. So you need to know where to start. And yeah, the idea that you start with will be the big item that you develop. It'll be the most well-written, the most dug into, the most interesting part.
This, I'll say, is where you, as a human person, get to sort of show your strengths, right? Gaia, for example, is going to focus very specifically on, like, how do the physics of the world work?
Which I have already done in other people's games.
Right? You want to know specific things about how a world works, right? I might be interested in I'm an environmental studies major. I'm interested in how different cultures interact with their environment and their different views on how to care for the environment. These people are very, like, stewardship prone, and these people don't really do that, and they're more, like, kind of exploitationists, and that's where I might start, right? Start from what you know. This is, again, that writing thing about, like, write what you know. That should be your starting point. If you really understand psychology, maybe that's where you start, right? If you really, really like, historical fashion, for example, maybe that's where you start. These people dress like this. Okay, why do they dress like that? And then you just write it down. I will say that the best campaigns I've ever written, just sort of as a little side note here, are in a binder with lined paper. Like, if I sit down at a laptop, they're going to get convoluted immediately. But if I sit down and I make myself write out my thoughts about what's happening, then I actually have stuff to go back to later. But you tend to find yourself, like, fleshing out little details and things as you're writing, right? Because you can go back and be like, oh, okay, this is informed actually by that. And there's not a great way to do that other than handwritten.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to have these single elements that are very much more well developed than anything else in the story. In many cases, that makes the story more interesting and gives it a reason to read that one specifically. And in some cases, it actually helps. If you're going to write a story about people, you're going to want your starting point to be people. A story about the world should start with the world. A story about the gods should start with the gods.
Right.
Your starting point should be the thing you want your story to be about to some degree.
Right. And if this is planning for a tabletop RPG, you can think about, like, what are your players interested in exploring, right? Do they want to look at the wilderness of the world? Are they really interested in politics, right? Like, where are we? What's the realm of specificity that we're playing in? Like, I'm going to talk about the Stormlight Archives for just a second here. I think the place that Brandon Sanderson starts, these books are huge, by the way. They're, what did I say earlier? They're like a foot in width when they're on my shelf.
Yeah, a foot long of paper.
Yeah, and like, so the pocket versions of them are wider than they are tall. Like, they're
just cubes.
They're just cubes. They're hilarious. Anyway, that world is very specific about its magic system, right? There is an order of, like, historical knights, and they, their weapons work specifically like this because of that, right? And it's I'm trying not to give away a lot here, but they're very specific in that, and then each culture is formed kind of with what their relationship to that historical order of knights is like, and that informs, like, those cultures' viewpoints. And that's all really, really strong world building. And it's actually the only book recently I've walked away from thinking, because he gives you sort of, like, 4 of 5 pieces of how the magic system works. And then I walk away going, right, like, well, how does that 5th bit work? And that's the piece that you can explore in a tabletop RPG, right? You can leave a little bit of open space, a little bit of a question.
So that gives the idea of a starting point for when you're doing your world building. So now you know what you're starting with. You've started to flesh out these key ideas. What do you do next? Well, the next big rule is my personal favorite as the physicist in the room, and it's build a set of rules. And I need to make something very specific. I need to say it very carefully here. Your rules do not need to be anything like real life. Mm-hmm. The rules need to be consistent. Mm-hmm. Let's say you build a world where you get magic through fighting a dragon and stealing the magic from it. Okay,
Sure.
so dragons are naturally magical beings.
Right.
You cannot effectively have other beings be magical without a significant exploration into why they are, right? And if you were to suddenly just say, well, this group is magic, who cares? You break the immersion, you break the world, and it doesn't work. Let's say you're in a world that is more like real life and rivers flow towards the ocean. They flow towards the lowest point that they can reach.
Yeah.
So if you have a river that suddenly is flowing up towards higher points, maybe up a mountain, up a hill, anything, there has to be a good reason for that.
Right.
And don't get me wrong.
Well, that could be a really good plot point to explore,
Yeah.
right? That could be a fun little twist of your system, but you have to have rules in place so that you can break them for fun.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, breaking rules is a good thing, but it has to be intentional.
Like, I want to talk about your dragon example for a second. So you have a world where historically, that's how magic happened, right? We killed all of the dragons. There's no dragons left, and we took all their magic, and that's how you have magic, right? If you introduce a group of people who are like typically non-magic, and then later you encounter one of them who is specifically magic, it might be fun to say like, oh yeah, they didn't kill a dragon. They killed something else and took its magic, and that's why their magic doesn't look like yours, right? That could just be a fun little thing to encounter.
Or, if you want to go another direction, killing multiple dragons gives you better magic.
Yeah.
And you don't know that until you meet someone who has a list.
Yes.
Which would be a terrifying moment for a protagonist in this series.
Right, you're like, you get fire magic, and you're like, great, I have fire magic. Everybody has one kind of magic, and you meet one guy who's got like 4. Mm-hmm. You've now created a situation where there's intrigue, but also like a little bit of terror. Like there's some rule that's been broken.
If I can give some a really good example of rules, I actually think Avatar: The Last Airbender does this perfectly.
Okay.
I actually don't think I've seen a better example.
I was when you said it, I was like, yeah, actually, this is exactly the example. Yeah.
So they set a rule that there are 4 types of controlling the elements around you: water, fire, air, and earth. And each one of them has a different style of movement, has a different culture built around it because of the advantages and disadvantages, completely different like civilization locations and styles and behavioral patterns, philosophies. Amazing world building, amazing starting point.
But it also all makes sense.
Yeah, they follow the rules strictly. The movements have to be the same. If you tie someone's hands together, they will struggle to do anything significant unless they primarily use other limbs for their control. And then they say there is the ability to control more, but it would take a lifetime of practice and will sacrifice a lot of the ability you could have had in your current skill, except for one, the chosen one, which, that's a trope. Picking the chosen one, and it's a good trope in my opinion, but the chosen one can learn all 4 without that detriment. Much like the shouts in Skyrim, you can learn shouts as any person through a lifetime of study. The Dragonborn can learn it however they want. Avatar is the same theme. But later in Avatar, they start talking about, well, someone who does do that lifetime of training could learn to combine 2 together, or take styles from one into another. And you start learning about lightning control as the ultimate fire ability, or blood control within the water ability.
Or metal bending from the earthbenders.
Exactly. There is a higher level of power you can reach, but they're very careful to explain it, to introduce it slowly, and to make sure it's well understood. They define a clear set of rules, and when they break them, it adds to the story, it adds to the character, and it makes a better story because of it.
Like, I remember the first time, like, in the series I saw, like, blood bending. And it's terrifying.
It is horrifying.
Part of the, like, understanding of the world is, like, you can control the elements which are external to a person, right? Like, that's very clear. Even if they never sort of say that explicitly, you understand that. And then at some point, they're like, people are made of water, so bloodbending. And that's horrifying. So again, define a set of rules and only break them when it adds to your narrative. And even then, you have to stick to them, right? You can't just sort of change it and then flip it back. Like, once you've broken that rule, for your players, it's always broken.
Exactly. And hey, real life has this too. Go study quantum physics if you want to see a good example of it. The real world has its own set of rules that get broken in ways that make the real world more interesting. But that gives an idea. Define rules on how your world operates. And this isn't cultural rules. I need to make this clear. This is, how does the world fundamentally work? Is there gravity?
This is very functional understanding.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, what defines your world? How does it exist fundamentally? How do the people do the thing you want them to do? Don't break it until it makes your story more enriching and you're willing to sit down and explain it. So let's go on to step number 4. And this is going to be a very generalized step. There's not as many specifics that we can give, but there are a lot of examples. Actually, every story I've ever written is a good example. So step 4. Now that you've had the theming, you've had the place to start, you've had the rules, build the world.
You're building out, right? You've got, I want to think, have you seen Actually?
I've seen a little bit.
Okay. There's this one mini game that they play. This is a game show about just like nerdy trivia, basically. So Actually does this one mini game where they take an image from, a series or something, and they just pixelate it all to hell, right? So the first time you see this image, it's basically like 9 blocks of color, right? Like it's just no definition at all. That's your theme, right? You kind of know what you're working with. You have a vague idea. You have an impression in your mind of what you're doing. Then you get to start filling in details, right? You get to add more pixels. Then you decide where to start. Are you starting with languages? Are you starting with the magic system? Are you starting with your political understanding? Like where are you starting? What are you interested in? And then we get to do step 4, which is putting everything together.
So the best way of thinking about this is, now that you have all of these tools with you and rules, you can say, what does the world look like? What are the continents and the mountains and the geographical features? And then you say, and notice I'm doing an order here for a reason, what are the civilizations that live here? And then what are the specific aspects of the civilization, like culture, food, laws, order, organization, everything else? How do they build houses, if that matters, right? And then you place the people. And I did give a specific order, but you can go backwards. If you care so much about specific characters, ask yourself, what culture and food styles and laws do they seem to follow or break, and build a civilization out of those rules, because it would fit the characters that you're building.
This is also where we get to talk about, like, what does villainy mean in a world, right? If you're going to have a big evil character that you want your players to defeat by the end of your game, this is where you start going, like, why does the world think that they're evil? And why do they think that they're right?
Well, let's say you want to make a villain more like, let's say, Voldemort from Harry Potter.
Sure.
As a simple example. Voldemort, fundamentally starting off, wasn't evil. He followed all the rules exactly. He became evil because he wanted to punish the Muggles.
Right.
Wizards who went to the school and followed the rules, whose biggest flaw was being born in the more human world. And that's it. His whole thing was just effective racism.
Yeah. So you could start there. You could say, well, okay, if this is villainous, then what does the world see as morally right? Okay, that means that, my main characters are going to believe that anybody who was born in the Muggle world is fine.
Is right? At least worth treating like a human being.
Exactly. Oh, here's one of my main characters. We're going to explore that world. Right? We're going to explore that intersection because our main villain is the opposite of this.
Yeah, or to think of morals, I will pull back to Persona. Spoiler warning, skip about 2 minutes if you don't want to hear the ending of Persona. The final villain of the DLC, Royale, his whole thing is he wants to make everyone happy and changes reality to the one where the maximum number of people are happy and have achieved happiness that they want and are no longer dealing with their struggles. So is that morally wrong? And this is a question for the player, but the party decides that this is morally wrong. This goes against their ethics. And it was so effective because the entire game prior built up this theme of you determine your own fate. This world sees determining your fate as the good.
So to have somebody else think that they know what's best is the nice little rule break, the nice little twist.
Exactly. And you can build a game up from this. When playing Persona, it feels like a game about characters. They defined the characters they wanted, other side characters who'd interact with them, and then what world goes around it? Now, yes, they actually did pick a real place in Tokyo. Like, quite seriously, you can go there. The cafe in that game is a real cafe in real life that you can go to.
This is the equivalent of that story of somebody being able to navigate Italy because they played a lot of Assassin's Creed. Like,
which is hilarious.
Which is so good. But
it is the idea of you design your world around your characters, or you design your characters around your world. Both of these are correct approaches, but it's important to have a pathway of your definition. If you care about characters, start there and build out. If you care about the world, start there and build in.
Right. I want to talk about step 5, which is the last kind of step on our list, because then you get to do, well, what story are you telling within this world? So step 5 is like defining the history, right? When we talk about like the Hunger Games, we were looking at a history of oppression as just a main theme. Lord of the Rings is war, right? You have these big events in world history that have changed parts of culture, right? In Avatar: The Last Airbender, you lose a whole civilization of one element of people.
The Airbenders.
Right? The Airbenders. So you take away something fundamental from your world to add to the story. You add a little bit of conflict.
Yeah. And if you want to look at maybe something a bit more abstract, the Forgotten Realms from D&D, there's lots of areas such as a city, the main city in the Forgotten Realms. I can't remember the name of it now. Like Neverwinter?
Sure.
Something like that.
Yes,
it has a massive crevice in the middle of it that has a magical barrier around it from 50 years ago that nearly destroyed the city in a cataclysmic event. So they likely built the world, built the city, built the interior of the city, slammed a crevice into it, and wrote the history.
Yeah.
Right? So what you can do once you have a world is ask questions like, why is the world like this? Why is, and you might do this during step 4. Don't get me wrong. Some of these things will end up coming together.
There's a lot of this where we've sort of talked about like step 2 and step 4 and
it'll be interlaced.
It's everywhere around, which is again why I'm going to say the binder is really good, because you then get to pick apart pieces that are relevant.
Exactly. But once you are really digging into your world, asking the question of why for the things that weren't fundamental to writing your story in the first place, lets you build depth where you might need it most. And that really brings us to the end of our steps. So to give a quick summary of them, pick a theme, decide where to start, define a set of rules, build out or in from this point, and then make sure you know the history, and if you're really feeling lucky, maybe talk a little bit about the future. And that gives you your world. So the hard part here is really putting this to practice. And now, Vi and I have both written a lot of worlds in our time, all of which have never been published, but we have spent a lot of time writing these worlds and talking to people who have published these worlds and reading about these worlds. So to help you on your world building journey or for understanding worlds, we have a series of tips that make it very easy to know when one of these steps went wrong. Now, having read these steps and listened to it, you probably already have an idea when they go wrong, but we have about 4 key tips. And I think I'll start with the first one. I've done a bit of research into this first one, and I'm going to pass the second one over to Vi.
Absolutely.
So I really want to stress that you need to avoid bioessentialism or other forms of determinism in your world. Now, that's a big word for me personally, so let me define it a little bit. Bioessentialism is the idea that certain biological groups act in a certain way simply because they're a part of the group. Now, this could be something as simple as saying women are natural caregivers or men are naturally better at like labor tasks. So all men do labor tasks and all women are caregivers.
I don't want to talk about Harry Potter more, but it's a really good example of where world building is poorly done in a lot of places.
In a lot of ways.
In a lot of places. The house, like one house of people is inherently evil. Like you just get sorted into
one house
evil.
Is inherently the protagonist.
Like that doesn't make any sense. Like why would you keep them in the school? Like there's so many. Anyway, it's bioessentialism.
I can see the frustration.
Everything about those books, the more I think about them, the like more grateful I am to have other books that are better.
Or even grateful to have them as a negative reference point.
Yeah, for this show. Or for
writing your own books to know what to avoid. But let's think about another example. Now, we've sung the praises of Lord of the Rings here, but Lord of the Rings has very much failed at this step because the orcs exist. And what are the orcs? They're evil and controlled by Sauron and Malakar, whatever the god above Sauron was. They do his evil bidding and they harm people and they enjoy harm, and that's all they are. And admittedly, it starts to feel pretty racist. Like, I know, like, I'm not the one who can dictate that, but many people who are smarter than myself and have spent more time into this than myself have said, yeah, they're racist. Like, they're evil because they're orcs. It's not the other way around. Like, these are orcs and they act evil. No, because they're orcs, they're evil. They are evil. So
this is specifically something you should avoid. If you find yourself thinking like, okay, I have this culture of people and they, worship a deity of like a snake god, for example. And I think that means that this culture is evil. You might actually start to flip it on yourself and go, okay, hang on. What if I just am telling this from the perspective of this culture? This one other culture thinks that these people who worship the snake god are evil because their god is inherently, different, right? Now you've just introduced conflict, but you can recognize that the people who worship like a snake god have the right to choose for themselves how they live their life, right?
Yeah.
Their beliefs just happen to be quote to unquote evil to another group of people.
Yeah. Or you might think of the dwarves. Do the dwarves mine and live underground because they're dwarves? Or did they happen to live in an area where that was the best decision and there are dwarves who break the mold? Are elves always like dexterous and hyper intelligent and crafty with them? Or is that just a standard for survival and there are plenty of elves who break that mold, right? It's not wrong to set up a mold. It's wrong to say all characters must fit that mold and that's our expectation. Sometimes it's more fun to build characters who break the mold and talk about the act of breaking the mold, like in real life, right? We have cultures in real life that are generally standards and people break away from, and nobody fits their culture perfectly. So your books should feel, or your worlds in general, should feel like that too. So let me throw the second tip over to you, Vi. Let's hear it.
Okay. I want to take you to a very specific place in your world building. We're going to talk about kind of where you're starting to talk to your players with the world and do broad strokes, and you're inviting your players to make characters. I want you to just not like over describe the world, right? Because fundamentally in tabletop RPGs, the magic happens when you leave places for the players to do things, right? So you want to leave some blanks to fill in later, right? There's a really fun article, or it's an interview with Brendan Lee Mulligan about like how to do world building, and one of the quotes is like, I'm just going to read this directly from the article. Someone can say, hey, this order of knights you mentioned, could I be a member of that order that had betrayed them and gone off and learned this wizard stuff? You don't want to have to design your world so richly that you're like, well, that wouldn't really be possible because according to Treaty 1174, instead you want to be able to be like, sure, let's talk about how that would work and what that would look like. So my advice is just leave some blank space on your map, in your head, allow space for development by your players, right?
And if you're looking on the video game side, you might notice that some worlds feel overly intense in certain areas that they become restrictive. This is the same problem. When they were designing the world, they set up the world so strictly that they didn't leave room for the player to be a part of it. But that covers that kind of idea.
Or the opposite. I'm thinking about a lot of just like
dead, empty games.
Oh, I'm thinking about like deserts in open world games where they're like, man, there's nothing here. Like, or you could go, you expect there to be nothing, but if you use this game mechanic in a certain way, actually, there's a whole bunch of stuff right here.
I like to think of a good example being the desert in Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. I loved that, but that kind of covers that idea. So tip 3, we're going to go through this tip quickly because we have been doing it for the entire episode. Take your ideas from successful works. Previous stories have done well because they knew what they were doing in certain areas. Find out what they did well. And we need to be very strict here. Study why they were successful. Harry Potter was successful because it spoke to people on a character level. The world is lacking. The Lord of the Rings was successful because the world was so deep and the characters perfectly fit into it. So think about why a book series or a story or a world was successful, and if it is successful in the way that you want to be, take styles and ideas from it. Mm-hmm. Because all works of fiction are simply based on previous works of fiction. You can, especially if you're doing a home game, you can take characters from favorite books, and so long as they fit the theme and they work in the world, you can add them to your game. Like Gideon from Gideon the Ninth has showed up in several of my personal games. One of them, I made the mistake of just being like, oh, and also this character's here and they're like Gideon, in a way that didn't work, because one of the reasons that character works in those books is because the world is kind of scary and a little bit weird. Like, it's mostly necromancy, but it's also like space, so you don't really understand what's happening. So Gideon is funny, like, is kind of comic relief to narrate this very frightening world. And to kind of break the tension. Yeah, and that's why it's effective. When you are already playing a game that's comedic and you're like, and here's a comedy character, you're not really adding anything useful to your story. Yeah. Even though I love the idea of Gideon, it just doesn't work in that game. Yeah, in a comedy, you might want a straight character in terms of like the person who is very serious and sometimes overly serious. Mm-hmm. I think the most recent Pokemon game had a professor who did exactly that. The main head of the school that you go to in Scarlet and Violet is very much an overly strict character in a more comedic game overall. Yeah. But that kind of takes point 3. And so for my last one, I might lean into the mic here. I want to make this one very serious, make sure everyone understands it very well. Plan around your players. We need to be very strict about this. You have a great idea for a world. You know that you want a wonderful religion. You want like a detailed hierarchy of gods and theories around them and interaction with them with the world. And then there's going to be like people who study the pantheon specifically to understand like why the world works the way that does. Yeah, you have like the family tree that like Greek mythology sometimes feels like a family circle sometimes. Yeah. All these like cool ideas, and then your game doesn't, like your players in the game never really explore the religion. In TTRPGs, you kind of tend to do this game by game, but in video games you might honestly think of Skyrim, which has one of the most detailed pantheons of gods I have ever read. And you will spend almost 100% of the game not really interacting with them at all or caring, except if you read the lore books. And if it wasn't for the fact that Skyrim is the 5th game in a series that has delved into the topics of the gods very intensely, especially in the 4th game, which is all about them, detailing all those gods would have taken many people, many hours, and wasted a lot of time that could have been spent on building a better world that your players interact with. Specifically for Skyrim 5, you're saying? Like, yes. In the absence of the other games, it would be a waste of time to build this pantheon for a game that doesn't explore it. Exactly. Yeah. The best thing you get from Skyrim is a couple unique items from the gods and maybe a couple interactions with them, but nothing serious, if that makes sense. Great. So we're going to do a little bit of an exercise. We only have like probably 10 minutes here to do this. Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left in this episode. So in really broad strokes, Guy and I are going to follow these steps that we've laid out, and we're just going to build a world right here. Let's build a world. Okay. Pick a theme. So we have to think about this idea of what kind of game do we want to play? So let's give an idea for those of you listening. We're going to build a world that fits pretty standard for new D&D players specifically. D&D, Pathfinder, that kind of area. Okay. So let's build a theme. Let's do a situation where we're planning a new game to play with a bunch of like brand new players. Yeah, we have some experience, some new, a good mix. Let's say that we are trying to introduce people to the idea of just a fantasy RPG. Yes. So we're going to start with like your kind of your classic D&D art, right? Like you know how all, like the art style is very similar through all the books? I think that's going to be our theme. We're going to do that like very typical high fantasy kind of thing. Yeah, a very formalized high fantasy. So okay. we got this idea. So we want high fantasy. So now let's ask a question. Is this game about the world, about the characters, or what? Now, if I had to pick, we have a game with players in front of us who are interacting with this world. Mm-hmm. So it has to be about the players. Mm-hmm. So is it players versus other characters or players versus the world? I really like the idea of players versus the world, just because it's a little bit more broad. But also I think that because we're sort of doing this as a new player kind of thing, we want these players to feel really successful
and like they're the main characters of their own arcs.
They want to be the chosen ones.
Yes.
So let's
hang on. Let's do a chosen one. Let's just say that there is, that each of these characters has been chosen for some reason.
Yeah.
To do something. Let's pick our starting point there.
Okay. So we have the theme, high fantasy theme. The players are interacting with the world, and the people they interact are really there to make the world feel better and more engaging for the players. So no specific characters, they're against the world itself. So we have our theme. Our starting point is really we want each player to feel like chosen one. So we want some big event for each player. So give me one example of some big event for a player.
Okay, let's do something super classic.
Yeah.
They are the chosen one of a specific deity. This god has been appearing to them in visions, and they're sending them on this quest, but they talk in riddles kind of thing, right? That's going to be very specific to that person. And they grew up in a culture that is very religious.
Okay.
Right? So they are sort of touted as somebody who is getting visions.
Yeah. So for the rest of this exercise, let's really hone in on this one player.
Cool.
Okay? So set of rules. We need a basic set of rules. So let me give a first rule. The gods have the ability to, let's say, lightly interact with the world.
Okay.
They can't call down miracles and destroy everything, but they can talk to you and they can appear in front of you and guide you and give you rewards.
I like the idea that the gods are like loosely related to elements, but they never exert a specific force.
Yeah.
I also would love if they never appeared. You never see a physical version of any of them.
So you can kind of feel the god in the element they represent, and they can speak to you in dreams, but seeing a god is a whole nother step.
Or maybe they can like speak to you, like if you have a god who is associated with the wind, you might actually hear their voice on the wind.
Yeah, kind of like loosely. Or the same with water, hearing it in the waves.
Okay, so this is going to mean that when we encounter places that are very elemental, there's going to be a very specific force there that feels like that god. When you enter a canyon that has lots of wind, you are going to specifically be able to commune with that spirit better.
Yeah, and a mountaintop is really digging into maybe, let's say, a god of storms, a god of clouds, right? The ocean is for the god of waves, and maybe a grassland or like a vibrant jungle is like the god of life.
Do we like the idea of the gods related to biomes or the gods related to things that are sort of more spread throughout the world?
Let's say things that are representative of them, and the more of it that's around you, the closer you are to that god.
I like it. Okay.
So if you're on the ocean, you are or even swimming, you are as close to the water god as you can be.
Ooh, what if like submersion in whatever that element is means that you can almost have a one-on-one conversation?
Yeah, assuming it's in a pure form. So like existing isn't air. You have to get like a perfect form of air.
Hang on, this means that any temple, any religious space is going to try to have those elements in it.
Yeah.
Right? If you are somebody who follows like a god of life, that temple's going to straight up be a greenhouse.
Yeah, it has to be a greenhouse. It has to be an animal sanctuary. It has to be perfect. A god, let's say healing is an element. It has to be an area where the sick are being healed actively, right?
For this life domain.
Yeah, for the life domain. Let's say it's like a healing specifically, one that gives life back rather than just life in general.
Okay,
it has to be a hospital.
Okay.
Fundamentally. But
consequentially, it would have to also be full of, but then there's like
consequentially,
death there too.
That's also where the death god would be.
I like this.
Right? And I like this idea. I like how it's going. And let's say, just to summarize everything else, basic fantasy physics, basic access to magic.
Yeah.
But let's add another one.
Well,
to get magic, you have to interact with the god of that type of magic, that element.
I like the idea that there has to be some event in your history that has to do with that like submersion into that space. Right?
Yeah.
You have to spend a lifetime at sea to be able to command water.
Yeah.
Right? You have to have there. I like the idea of there having to be an action that creates magic, so that these chosen ones are outside of this rule. They have magic, but they're young.
And they don't know why.
Yeah, and there's no way they could have gotten magic, right? None of them are like one of them might be a sailor maybe, but they're not they haven't sailed for, 20 years or something to commune with the god to get magic. They just showed up and they were like, I can do water stuff. And that's how people were chosen.
Yeah. And let's say as one final fundamental rule, this means anyone who can do magic is inherently religious. So they're either priests of their god or champions of the god, very involved.
Specifically tied to the god.
Yeah.
Okay.
And getting multiple would be near impossible. Even for chosen ones, getting 2 requires 2 gods' blessings. And let's say these gods exist, they might not get along that well.
Yeah. I was going to say...
Jealousy,
I think there should be some sense of not a familial relationship between everybody, like between the gods necessarily. I kind of like the idea that they kind of know each other in a vague sort of way. In the way that grass knows wind, but they're not buddies.
And I want to push the gods are jealous. If you're with one, the gods as a nature are really investing in some living being.
Okay.
Right? So if you try to get 2, they'll basically tear you apart with it.
Oh, I really love the idea. If you were trying to worship both life and death, they would be we're not 2 sides of the same coin. We are 2 different coins.
Yeah, and the only way to get both, right, is to somehow combine it. So it can happen maybe, but basically never.
This would be mad scientist. I'm going to go, if this is the submersion thing again, it's going to be I'm going to go do these 2 things simultaneously.
Yeah.
And see if I can make that happen.
And normally it fails, like Lichdom in normal fantasy ideas.
I like the idea of it physically tearing you in half.
I do like that, physically tearing you apart.
Yeah, I would. Okay, so that means there's got to be some legend about, people who try to do this, basically explode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, so we now have that. So we have a few minutes.
Explode, and then their bodies become those 2 elements.
Can dissolve into the elements.
Yeah, which means that you could find a clearing where there are specifically 2 dividing lines of a very straight part of ocean and a really rich part of land. If someone was trying to worship water and air or life or whatever we're gonna call that.
Yeah. So now let's try to get a basic idea of the world.
Okay.
After this point. So basic cities. Let's say we want our character to fundamentally become a champion of the god of wind, and they've been a chosen one who has to do it. So let's say we build 3 things, and I'm going to just summarize them very quickly. Sure. City 1, standard fantasy city. No dedicated devotion to one god, and suddenly they have some degree of minor wind powers. So they go on a journey to travel to the capital of the god of wind, the worship of the wind, right? And let's say it's a journey that brings them over general fantasy difficulties, and the city itself is kind of like a floating city. Structural integrity is not really there because it doesn't need to be there. The buildings are kind of can move themselves. The people themselves move very effectively, so roads aren't a thing. Very chaotic kind of design.
I like it.
I
like the idea of it being kind of like honeycomb. It's more of a hive than it is a city.
Yeah. Cool. And they make it to the temple. They commune with the god. We're not going to go too specific into that, right? And then they have to go on some mission. So we have to define the anti of the wind god, maybe the earth god.
Sure.
And we have to define that area for where their mission goes. And that, honestly, we kind of have already touched on the history in our world building. And that gives us a basic world.
So let's talk about some specific things, just as examples. So we've got these cultures who are... have sort of very clear delineations, right? Let's just talk about, for example, what kind of food people who worship an air god would eat.
Well, I think it would be food that's very fluffy. Maybe they would have cakes, but it might feel more like real-life sponge cakes.
Right.
They probably would be avoiding strict...
Probably a lot of leavened bread.
Yep, they'd probably avoid strict soups and dense foods, right? And maybe they're probably a big fan of more desserts, fluffy kind of sugary things.
There might be some kind of legend about if your cake doesn't rise, you should go talk to the air god because he might be mad at you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay,
kind of
cool.
rituals like that.
I like that. I like that there's a little bit of ritual culture to it. All your everyday beliefs and actions are not predetermined, but are very much impacted by your god. So if you're I worship the god of rain, and it hasn't rained in a while, I'm the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that gives us a basic world.
Yeah.
And I think we're coming right upon a minute left in our time. So with this world, you now have a good starting point to build a full game for your players.
Now, this is where I would present it to your players. Go broad strokes, like what we just said. That's what you tell your players.
Yeah.
And then you go, what do you want to explore? And someone's like, I really like the idea of the wind god. I love the idea of fire god. Or like, I like the idea of being curious about, exploring two gods at the same time. Right? So you might go, okay, well, like how are you balancing that? And that's where you start your player specific discussions.
Yep.
And that's where you can build like maps and stuff from here.
And that gives us our whole world. So that's the end of today's episode. We've covered the steps for building a world, picking your theme, where to start, your set of rules, building the world itself, and then the history for it, as well as some basic tips, don't over-describe, for example, and then a bit of an example on how to build a world. So when you have to build a world for your next game, you're ready. So that covers everything. I'm Gaia.
I'm Vi.
And if you want to hear more from us or listen to past episodes, tune in live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And if you're online, you can listen live at chsrfm.ca or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next time.